It seems like a quantum jump, both the metabolic psychiatry and psychedelic psychiatry.
I do see it as like a system reset and then back to sort of default function. The idea is that we become injured by life, adversity, trauma, get reinforced in a particular way, perhaps for defensive reasons. But I think there's something to it. I don't think it's all of it, but I do think it's a shake-up, a recalibration of the parameters, if you want.
Robin Carhart-Harris is a neuroscientist
and leading researcher in psychedelic therapy,
known for his groundbreaking studies
on psilocybin and mental health.
And what we're finding with these compounds is 1, 2, 3 sessions seems to do the trick.
Our first patient had been on, I don't know how many antidepressants, and this got her well, and she's still well. So it can turn things around.
It seemed like they're sort of cracking open on pathways for people to explore around getting relief from really intractable problems that create so much human suffering. So Robin, your work has been really revolutionary in the whole field of psychedelic medicine. Even saying psychedelic medicine is kind of a bit of a heresy. And yet here we are. I think Michael Pollan wrote his book, How to Change Your Mind, in 2018. And that set off this whole conversation in our culture around psychedelics and their impact on mental health, on performance enhancement, neuroplasticity, and the treatment of really treatment-resistant conditions in medicine like PTSD, depression, and more, sometimes more serious conditions. And your work has really pioneered a lot of the mechanistic understanding of how these things work in the brain, which is something that a lot of people really have not focused on. They focus on, does it work clinically? What's the benefit? But how does this actually changing your brain to actually have these impacts as something that I think no one's really taken a deep look at, except, your work has really pioneered that. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this whole field because, we've really failed in so many ways in psychiatry to deal with some intractable problems. Mental health crisis is huge. Depression is, the biggest source of disability and loss of quality of life years, and cost to society. It causes so much unnecessary suffering. And, we've really had very poor modalities for treating it. And a lot of the SSRIs and antidepressant medications, psychiatric meds, don't work that well. They don't work for a lot of people. They often have side effects, and they're often things you have to take for life, but don't really cause true remission. They might mitigate symptoms. And here we're talking about a medicine that people are researching like you that has the potential to really interrupt this whole cycle of chronic mental illness and get people free by changing the structure and function of the brain in ways that we never have seen possible before. And it's interesting because these compounds have been used, throughout human evolution for I don't know how many thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years when the first person came upon a psychedelic who was a hunter-gatherer way back when. And now we're introducing these into medicine, which haven't been quite approved for use as a pharmacotherapy with the FDA, but it's coming soon. So what I'd love to start out with is asking you, how did you get into this whole field, and what pulled you into the whole field of neuroscience and psychedelics and the intersection of those two things?
Sure. Well, these days I tend to give the the honest and sort of transparent answer, which is that it did start.
You went to a party and you had a great experience.
There you go. Well, funnily enough, yes, I took some LSD. It was psychedelic use. It was LSD, and I was very young. I was in my teens. I was curious. I just, had heard things and wanted to know for myself. So that experience opened my mind, as the cliche goes, but that is what happened. And then over the years, I was drawn to psychology and depth psychology in particular. So psychoanalysis, psychodynamic psychology, a school or perspective of psychology that recognizes that the mind is more than the conscious mind, that there's an unconscious domain or realm, in a sense that the mind is far deeper than we realize through the vantage of normal waking consciousness. And so that was the discipline that I was schooled in. During studying psychoanalysis, I discovered that psychedelics had been used in psychotherapy as tools to catalyze and deepen psychotherapy. And that was done in the mid 20th century. And it was a big thing for a while. Big names like Ethel Kennedy and Cary Grant had this therapy and seemingly had been benefited from it. And so when I found that, and I had had my own psychedelic experiences, a light bulb went off, and I thought, oh my goodness, this psychoanalysis thing, I was loving it, but it felt somewhat more like an art than a science. And being quite practically minded, I wanted some tools to better, in a sense, the science of the mind, and you might say the science of psychoanalysis even. And so I thought, wow, this is an opportunity. And through that, I reached out to people who I hoped could enable a path towards studying psychedelics. And I was lucky in reaching out to the right people. A guy called David Nutt, who some will have heard of. He's the former chief scientific advisor to the UK government on drug policy, the so-called drug czar. Been running something called Drug Science ever since. So generally a drugs expert. And he opened the door for me. I managed to do a PhD with him. Another important person in this story is Amanda Fielding of the Beckley Foundation. She provided support, brought in funding as well for the work. So we went down a track of doing a series of what became a series of brain imaging studies with different psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, I mean, this is really an interesting point because most of your background was in basically traditional psychoanalysis and also in psychopharmacology. The joke in medicine is that neurologists pay no attention to the mind and psychiatrists pay no attention to the brain. And so you said, like, well, why don't we look at the brain and see what's happening in here? And why are we seeing these state changes for people that have profound sort of longitudinal impacts in relieving suffering from mental illness? What's actually happening in the brain? And I think that's kind of a revolutionary idea because really nobody's really looked at the function structure of the brain and how it's impacting mental health. And like, what are the biomarkers of psychiatric illness? We don't really have them. We have this classification system, which is the DSM-5 or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual number 5, that categorizes people based on their symptoms and to groups of diagnoses like depression or anxiety or bipolar or schizophrenia. And there's subcategories of each one. It gets very granular, but it doesn't tell you anything about the mechanism or what's happening in the brain or the cause. And I think what's fascinating to me about psychedelic medicine is that you're beginning to look at the brain, and your work starts to look at functional MRI imaging, EEGs, changes in brain states. And I think I'd love to sort of talk to you about how do you think about these things in the context of mental health and in terms of the psychedelic experience and the intersection of psychedelic drugs or medicines and these physiological measurable changes in the brain, and then the consequential benefits that people see of relief of depression or PTSD or suffering. I'd love to sort of unpack that a little bit for us, because it's something that...
Of course, yeah. Well, part of why I've been looking forward to this conversation is that I suspect we might align to some extent on our perspectives here, because, I have that background in depth psychology, so that's all sort of mind stuff. Dare I say it, soul stuff, psyche translate most literally as soul. So it's the whole of the mind. And yet I also was schooled in basic neuroscience and neuropsychopharmacology. So I tend to see this thing that we're looking at as having two faces, like the two sides of a coin. I also quite like the analogy from physics of wave particle duality, that something can exist in two ways based on an observer. Really, it's us coming in, taking a look at it, and then say a wave collapses to a particle, and we see it as particle because of us coming in and measuring it. It's a little bit like that, I think, with mind and brain. We could look at the mind side and take a good look and write many books about it and stroke our beards and so on. Or we can look through the metaphorical telescope of brain imaging and look at this biological phenomenon and its dynamics. And the two are entangled, again, a sort of a term from physics, quantum physics. And I think there's something to that view, and that's how I go about my work. It's like a Libra, like a scale with an equal balance of the mind and soul stuff and the biology. And I've come to the view, as I know others have too, that perhaps our failings over the decades and longer in mental health care has come about through being too locked into a particular prism or perspective. Um, for example, for a good 50 years plus, biocentrism has dominated psychiatry. We have heads of the major funding bodies saying these aren't mind disorders, they're brain disorders,
Mm.
and it's almost like a diktat. You're sort of being told to think of it that way, but is it the truth?
Mm.
Um, or would it be healthy to think of these disorders as existing and expressing, yes, in the biological domain, but also the psychological and the social, and dare I say it, the spiritual too? Could we think of causation along those tracks as well?
Mm.
Um, could we get insight from one particular tract, while acknowledging that the other tracks or tracks, they don't then go into non-existence, they're always entangled. So think, for example, about a placebo. You might have a psychological response to a placebo, say it's given for pain, and you experience some pain relief. And then we know in neuroscience that that process has a biological counterpart, even though the mechanism on the face of it looks psychological. So these things are
Right.
always entangled.
Right.
I think there's something healthy about, holding these things in balance, and not getting too locked into any particular perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, when you think about the history of these compounds throughout human evolution, they've been usually delivered in the context of a spiritual framework. So whether it's
Yeah.
medicine men, with peyote in Native American tradition, or the shamans of South America with ayahuasca, or the Yaqui Indians with maybe toad medicine, or different things that they've done. So I think there's a really interesting kind of context with these evolved from, which is to create a spiritual experience that allows you to evolve as a human being. And what I find really fascinating is, I'm sure you know this book by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson, called Altered States, where they took lifetime meditators, guys who've been in a cave in Tibet for 40 years, meditating for tens of thousands of hours, and they brought them to the United States. They put them in functional MRI machines, and they saw that their function in their brain was different. That their things like the default mode network were suppressed, which is this area of the brain that identifies yourself as the ego, separate, different. Then it's suppressed. It makes you feel connected with everything, one with everything, and it's very similar to what happens with psychedelics. And this is a lot of what your work has found, is that these kinds of brain correlates of spiritual experiences are there, and it's kind of like a shortcut to kind of, instead of spending 40 years in a cave meditating, you kind of get to have a glimpse of what it's like to see reality in a different way. And you have this really interesting theory, this entropic theory of the brain, and how these psychedelic medicines disorganize our thinking, and that's often rigid or fixed, that keeps us in our perspective and our suffering and our particular worldview, and it kind of breaks that open and allows you to have a different view of things. So would you talk more about some of the things that happen in the brain as a result of these psychedelic treatments?
It was funny comparing notes with the Buddhists, so to speak,
Yeah.
and seeing so many parallels. It's something that often comes up in the psychedelic domain, that there are parallels with, say, Buddhist insights and methods, of course, meditation being a classic one. And yes, talking to neuroscientists doing work on the neuroscience of meditation, and seeing similar things, dips in default mode network activity, for example, as people get out of their ego tunnel, and into something broader. So that was cool to see that, that in our blobs on brains, the images that we get from our fMRI scanning and such, like, we were seeing the same thing, these blue blobs in regions of the default mode network and so on. over time, that perspective personally, I would say, matured into this entropic brain hypothesis. I'd be more daring and call it an entropic brain principle now,
Mm.
because it seems so well supported. It's a principle that describes the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness, what it is like to be in any state of being, a state of consciousness. At one far end, the end of low entropy, the lights go out.
Mm.
Sort of literally, there's nothing there. You're knocked out with an anesthetic. You're in deep sleep. You've suffered a brain injury. You're in a coma. There's no content. And if you look at ongoing brain activity, it's very uneventful. It's very predictable. It's very low entropy. And if you are lucky enough to say, come out of a disorder of consciousness, or you wake up from your deep sleep, or you recover from your anesthetic, the entropy comes back and brain activity is much more rangeful, much more diverse, much less predictable. And that corresponds to this increase in entropy. So we knew that for a few years, but what psychedelic research did was to show that you can dial that entropy even higher. And that was another light bulb moment for me. We first saw it around 2017. We published on it with LSD, psilocybin, and also ketamine in a psychedelic-like dosage. Saw brain entropy dial up under all of those compounds, and with it, people's conscious experience, their subjective experience, was deeper, richer, more diverse, more changeable. So for me, that was like a moment, a kind of aha moment of, oh, there's a mapping here. There's a mapping, and it's a really simple one,
Mm.
between, in a sense, more bits, and I say that intentionally, more bits going on in brain, more bits in conscious experience. And that's the gist of the entropic brain principle.
Interesting. So if you're looking at um, these states, as sort of a more freedom and flexibility in a sense in brain function, in the way entropic means disorganized or coming apart, right? And
Yeah.
yet there's a freedom in that allows you to get liberated from these rigid, structured patterns of thinking and feeling and emoting that are often at the root of a lot of the mental illness suffering that people have. So, at the other end of the spectrum is mental illness, and that actually is often less entropy and less flexibility and less ability to sort of see things in a different way. I mean, so it's what you're saying, that these compounds actually allow you to see the same life you're having, but through a different lens.
There's something that I think is direct and very functional, like computational, that is the drug, causing this scrambling like effect. And when I was saying, yes, comparing notes with the meditation researchers and seeing the same blue blobs in the same regions of the brain in meditation in the psychedelic state got us excited, but then things matured on into this entropic brain principle. There, the maturation, in a sense, was a realization that it's a change in the quality and the quantity, but the quality of activity with the psychedelic in the direction of this entropic spectrum, higher entropy. And you could sort of glibly describe that as a scrambling up. Um, and so, sure, it looks like a drop of activity in the default mode network, for example, or another region, but it's actually a dysregulation. So it's a subtle difference. But these days, I do like to say it because it's
Yeah.
more accurate. That it's not that we shut off the default mode network. That's a popular, in a sense, myth that people like. And you can get away with it, but it's not really true. You're not turning it off, you're scrambling it up.
Mm.
And in scrambling it up, and I say it that way because it's still very active. It's just the activity is irregular now. It was regular in normal waking consciousness, and that regularity of rhythms in the brain is really what characterizes the structure and functioning of normal waking consciousness. And that structure is breaking down under the psychedelic. So yes, it gives us freedom, because in normal waking consciousness there are constraints,
Mm-hmm.
and much of what normal waking consciousness is, and the way the brain is governing it, involves constraint, involves a kind of data compression. It's like chunking, you know,
Mm.
chunking information into broad chunks, like the gist of things, like seeing the whole of a forest rather than individual trees. We do that all the time. This kind of gestalt, you know, seeing the whole rather than the individual parts. We're doing that all the time. We're doing it right now with the language that we're using, you know, metaphor and so on, just chunking stuff up, this data compression. And the entropic brain effect is a data decompression. All those bits now, you know, that literally relate to the increase in entropy, are being sort of unpacked from this otherwise sort of zipped up, you know, style of functioning in normal waking consciousness. So it's like, you know, an unzipping of what's all this information, and that does breed freedom of mind. And a really exciting development that I've realized only in recent years, is that I strongly suspect that there's a formal relationship between brain and mind entropy, I would say, and brain and mind plasticity.
Mm-hmm.
Plasticity, people should know, isn't necessarily neuroplasticity. We tend to think of it that way. Neuroplasticity has a great seductive appeal. It's a great brand in a sense. Oh, psychedelics promote neuroplasticity. They've got to be good, you
Right.
know? That's generally the way it goes. But people should know that psychedelics promote plasticity. Let's lop off the neuro for a bit. What does plasticity mean? It means the property of changeability or malleability, the ability to be shaped or molded. So that's a very basic thing that could apply to all sorts of things.
And why is that
And in
good? Yeah, why is
biology,
that good in mental illness?
because we get stuck, just as you were alluding to, we get stuck in reinforced ways of feeling, thinking, behaving. And that characterizes not all of mental illness, but most of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the principal component of mental illness, getting stuck in these reinforced ways of being. Why do we do it? That's another question. I strongly suspect we do it because it's defensive, because it's a way to get by, rather than swimming in a horrible state of suffering all the time. At least we've got our whatever, you know, crack pipe, or escape into delusion, or, you know, caloric control that gives me a sense of controlling my body and my feelings, and anorexia. You know, so much of mental illness, I believe, and I think others suspect it too, is this reinforcement, this getting stuck in ruts.
Mm.
I call it canalization, which, funnily enough, formally is the inverse of plasticity. Plasticity is changeability. Canalization formally means an inability to change.
Well, that's fascinating because if you know what's really remarkable to me with these compounds that are being used, whether it's MDMA or psilocybin or LSD or ibogaine, is normally in medicine you have a chronic condition like depression or PTSD. You need to take chronic medications, and what we're finding with these compounds is, 1, 2, 3 sessions seems to do the trick. And it doesn't quite make sense because how does the effect last, right? It's not like the drug is still in your system or the compound is still in your system. How do you see these persistent benefits with only episodic short-term use rather than pharmacological solutions to psychiatric illness, which are chronic, lifelong medications?
Well, I know it's a very computational way to put it, but I do see it as like a system reset, you know, and then back to sort of default function. And so the idea is that through the, slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, we become injured by life, adversity, trauma, get reinforced in a particular way, perhaps for defensive reasons, likely for defensive reasons. And so it's not the default function anymore. This system looks atypical. And to wider society, this looks atypical, alcoholism or hard drug abuse or starving oneself in anorexia.
Yeah.
That doesn't look normal. That doesn't look healthy. So what do you do with that? And it seems very simplistic, very computational, but I think there's something to it. I don't think it's all of it, but I do think it's a shake-up. It's a system reset, a recalibration of the parameters, if you want.
I mean, is it the insights that people have while they're on them, or is it something about the compounds and how they affect the structure and function of the brain?
It's both, because the insights and the quality of the experience seem to matter. So if we go by data and evidence, which we should, then the trip itself seems to matter. Some people have been debating that recently, but we should be data-led. It sometimes surprises me that they're more willing to look at mouse data than human data. But human data says the experience matters. I think they do that because they're mouse researchers and they can't hear about the experience of the mouse. But that's the limitation, But in our species and the species that we're trying to treat, we have that privilege, and people report on their experiences. They rate them. They rate different dimensions of their experiences. And we find that a couple of dimensions I'll highlight. One, yes, it's psychological insight, very strong predictor of therapeutic outcomes downstream. The other one is emotional release. It's strong emotion. What is that? What's that look like? Well, often it looks like people crying.
Yeah.
It's a cathartic release. And maybe people can join the dots there and think about depth psychology, and catharsis was a strong aspect of depth psychology, and thinking about how psychoanalysis as a psychotherapeutic modality can work. That there's repression, and then there can be in psychoanalysis, in the talking cure process, there can, if you're lucky, over the years, there can be a strong release of emotion, and that can be therapeutic. And that was noticed by Freud and others. But with psychedelics, that ability to release pent up, repressed feeling, emotion is very much catalyzed. It's really a key part of the secret sauce there. So yeah, sure, I characterize things in this very computational way, a system reset, but that's not all of it. People aren't offline. It's not like ECT. It's not like shock therapy. It's not like you just scramble people up that way. The scrambling up has an experience to it, and a very rich experience. And you're online. You're in this waking dream. And so you can remember it, you can tell it back. And what is that? What does that look like? Well, if you look at all the different dimensions, emotional release, psychological insight, and also a spiritual component as well, is really, the core factors that seem to be the vehicles that carry people towards therapeutic outcomes.
Well, that's sort of an interesting way of reframing, medicine, which is very mechanistic, right? You're talking about, yes, there are mechanisms and things we're seeing in the structure and function of the brain. We're seeing this sort of disorganization that allows you to be free from rigid patterns of thought and feeling and emotion, and kind of reset the brain into its original factory settings. But you're also talking about, a deeper, kind of more mushy area, which is sort of the soul, consciousness, spiritual experiences, which these tend to invoke. And I think one of the things that you're studying is 5-MeO DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, which is a compound that's found in nature in the Sonoran Desert toad, and it's very short-lived. I've done it once. It was quite remarkable, and I imagine you've done it as well. And it was unlike anything I've ever experienced, but it was very short experience, but you had this sense of pure experience with no thing in it. It was just pure light and white and blissful, and almost like you were dead, but you're alive. It was almost like when you hear those stories of
Yeah.
people having these blissful experiences of, going through that white tunnel as they die, and then having these sort of a blissful, peaceful experience. I mean, that's sort of what it is. And I know when you're born and when you die, you have a release of DMT in your brain that is normally there in small amounts. So I'm curious about this particular compound and how you see it in differently or similarly to things like psilocybin or MDMA, and what you're finding with this particular compound, which I think you're using in different studies now.
Well, I'd love to. We've got a grant application in with NIMH, so fingers crossed there. And it would be a brain imaging study combining EEG and fMRI, so looking at brain waves with the kind of swimming cap EEG device, electrical activity oscillating across time. And with fMRI, we get the very granular, fine-grained spatial resolution. So those in combination are very complementary, and that's the lens that will look at the brain under the effects of 5-MeO. But it's a massive challenge because it's hard to find people who can stay still on 5-MeO. You can find them. People call them Buddha sitters, because they go into this like enlightenment state and also are very still when they do it. The phenomenology, the psychological effects profile of 5-MeO seems a little extra, seems a little different to psychedelics, which are wild and weird enough, so how is that even possible that there could be anything more than, say, an LSD trip?
Yeah.
So it's truly remarkable. Michael Pollan called it the Everest of psychedelics.
Yeah.
Others have called it, whatever,
The God
the
molecule.
king and this kind of thing. The God molecule,
right.
Yeah, the ultimate. And then, with the entropic brain principle, pure theory here, because we don't have much, if any, real quality human brain imaging data yet. Pure theory has led me to think that pure consciousness, which is just as you were describing it, you described it as pure experience, white, so not black, not a blackout. It's not that the lights went out. All of the lights of a myriad suns, as Stan Groff described it. This brilliant white light, like the light that's been described in near-death experiences, as you said. So that's at this other end of the spectrum. As I see it, blackout down this end with very low entropy. And so if this whiteout is up here, is it extremely high entropy? That's what I've suspected. And I don't know yet, because we don't have the data. In fact, there's some data that's come through that suggests some paradoxical quality to the activity, that you also get some slow waves, which is weird. So maybe a bit like sleep, but then a bit or a lot like a psychedelic opening up, an expansion. So I suspect that we're missing something at the entropic end. And this is a thing that people don't always realize, that we're liberated by the tools that we have, like the first scientist, Galileo, using his telescope to see further. But he could only see so far as well. Those telescopes have got a lot better since, and we've been able to see further and further and further. And so we should be aware that our tools right now can only allow us to see so far. And seeing very fast brain activity ain't easy, It's easily confounded by like muscle artifact, even things like people smiling, people laughing, moving around. It really messes up the data. I strongly suspect that there is a strong entropic component to the 5-MeO experience. And put it this way, that's kind of a big part of the quest that I'm on in studying 5-MeO, is to test that hypothesis.
And how do you?
But I do see it's a bit.
Well, how
Sorry,
do
Mark.
you see it being used clinically in differentiating it from the use of psilocybin or MDMA? Is in other words, with all these pharmacological effects of these compounds, are there specific indications that are better or worse for different compounds? For example, ibogaine is being used for addiction, right, to break the cycle of addiction, which is really fascinating. But How do you see these sort of as a cocktail of new psychopharmacological compounds that aren't necessarily new? They've been around some for thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years being used in
Yeah.
human societies. How do you see the indications being different?
Well, I do have a dream, as others do, of like the Doctor of the Future having a briefcase that he opens it up and he's got some ketamine, some MDMA, some psilocybin, and so on, some ibogaine, and he hears about the symptom profile and the history. And it's not that one drug will work always better than the other necessarily. So there's some subtlety to it. There's almost some artistry to it, I think. But let's take, for example, someone with a history of complex trauma, now with a lot of emotional instability, difficult history with relationships, something in that domain of what the DSM would call a borderline personality disorder. Should they have a big trip on LSD, or could that be psychologically agitative?
Yeah.
Could that even tip them over into a psychotic disorder
Mm.
if poorly managed? And it could. So I wonder whether lower doses and a longer regimen of, say, an experience every month or 2 or 3 over a 12-year period. The gold standard treatment for borderline is a long psychotherapy. A year or so of psychotherapy.
Yeah, DBT. Yeah.
Yeah, quite. So why not slot the psychedelic dosing into that approach, rather than slam someone with 5-MeO, let them meet God and expect it to be one and done,
Yeah.
and everything's cushy now. It's too simplistic. It sounds a bit like what in spiritual circles some might call bypassing the work,
Yeah.
the hard work of actually, oh God, I have to go back there and talk about how I was abused or what have you. I'd rather not, of course you'd rather not, but maybe that is a big part of the roots, sadly, tragically, that's feeding the way your life has been and continues to be. So it's hard work, but we can't bypass it. So that would be one of the subtleties. But then there are others who are, locked into this reinforced pattern of escape through hard drug abuse or alcoholism. They could benefit from a big reset, that factory settings reset. And I suspect that you can get there through, say, ibogaine. It's a very long trip. It's a very much, it sounds like, I've never gone there myself, but a thorough life review. That might be a big recalibration for people, so that's that computational perspective without divorcing it from a psychological one, because people have the life review, they realize things that they've repressed or what have you, things that they've sort of not wanted to look at, shadow aspects of the psyche.
Mm.
Yeah, maybe you can have that factory reset effect also through a short-lived blast with 5-MeO. That could be useful. It's just difficult to know how long that window would stay open for, and whether you've been guilty, so to speak, of some bypassing. Like you haven't really done the work. You've bypassed levels of the psyche in a sense. You bypassed the personal, what's happened in your lifetime, and maybe even bypassed, a kind of collective unconscious transpersonal with archetypal beings and themes of human nature, not just your own life, and gone to something so transcendent that it's pure consciousness that's beautiful, and you've realized that love is a fundamental and so on. Yet there's been some bypassing there, and in time, as you return to normal waking consciousness, you haven't kind of massaged away those knots that came about because of you know, uh, uh, adverse life experiences. And sadly, whether it's your past or the nature of the sort of matrix of your current life circumstances, things will conspire to pull you back.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be so naive and idealistic to think that a one and done model is going to be super beneficial in the long term.
So essentially, it's combining, and this is how it's being in the FDA now, in an attempt to approve MDMA therapy is psychedelic assisted therapy. So it's not just the psychedelic, but it's combined with therapy to help integrate or process the emotions to sort of make it stick a little bit better. And so it seems like, there's different use applications for different things, like, everything from very severe mental illness and complex PTSD to, treatment resistant depression, all the way on the other end of the spectrum to, cognitive enhancement and spiritual, sort of development, right? So you've got this whole spectrum of use of these compounds, from people who are really struggling and sick and suffering to people who just want to kind of reach a different level of awareness or consciousness or spiritual development. So I find that fascinating, because there's very few things in medicine like that where you have a use case that's quite broad.
Isn't it? It's almost the full spectrum. I guess, where is it not? And there's a question mark over schizophrenia, for example. It's not clear to me that would be, it certainly wouldn't be easy, and would it be sufficiently, beneficial over risky? And it's a tough call, that one.
Well,
Maybe delusional disorder.
yeah, because you've got brain disorders that are more medical. I would say schizophrenia, autism. These are encephalopathies. They're metabolic encephalopathies of the brain, and they are now being treated with mitochondrial therapies such as a ketogenic diet or mitochondrial interventions such as supplements that, like Suzanne Go, who's been on the podcast, talked about with autism, where she sees on fMRI scans, basically an energy deficit. And we're seeing bipolar disease, schizophrenia, and severe mental illness being treated with ketogenic diets, which also do similar things, such at Mayo and many other places. What's interesting about things like depression or trauma or PTSD or anxiety is that they're often a combination of both structural issues that are in terms of how the brain's operating, but also have sort of been developed as a result of life experiences and traumas. So they're not necessarily just purely a sort of metabolic problem. Like, I don't think schizophrenia or autism is because you had trauma or had some terrible life experience. These are brain disorders that are more sort of fixed in their pathobiology. But you've got something like depression or anxiety or PTSD, even in addiction. These are things that kind of rise out of life experience, and then the brain has changed in some way, and these psychedelics seem to unlock the brain from its rigid, stuck patterns in beliefs, and allows then sort of the ability to start to process things where talk therapy or psychoanalysis maybe hasn't been effective, or even drug therapy with like SSRIs and other psychiatric medication.
Just to healthily play devil's advocate, I wouldn't be too absolutist about even schizophrenia and autism in saying that there couldn't, in the pathogenesis of those disorders, have been certain styles of life experience that contributed. There's a thing that can happen in medicine that you'll be super aware of, that you can have these explanations of convenience almost, that oh, okay, it's nothing to do with parenting, say, and good, we can put it all on the genetics, say, but genetic explanations of mental illness over time, and in recent years in particular, have been found to be so fallible, to lack specificity. And sure, there's a genetic contribution to autism and schizophrenia in particular, but the schizophrenia, it lacks specificity and smudges into other diagnostic categories. Most schizophrenias are preceded by mood disorder, depression, anxiety. So it ain't so clean cut, and that's one thing that we've realized in psychiatry, that there's so much overlap. It's like biopsychosocial problems requiring biopsychosocial solutions, and even in the domain of, say, schizophrenia, if we go to bio, we might not necessarily be treating then the whole of the picture. It's so hard, of course, classically to to come at schizophrenia with psychological intervention, but people are doing that in sophisticated, interesting, novel ways through things like avatar therapy,
Mm.
where through computer animation you can create an avatar, an image, an animated image of the voice, the persecutory voice,
Mm.
tormenting voice, and then work in dialogue to sort of change your relationship with this persecuting voice,
Yeah.
almost to make peace with it so that it starts to quieten down. So there could be clever ways to combine, biopsychosocial in treating even things that on the face of it look especially one way,
Like
say biological
multimodal
or schizophrenia.
treatments. You can't just do one
Yeah.
approach. I think that's fascinating. You're probably right about that. What's so fascinating to me though is this incredible revolution we're seeing in psychiatry from two different angles. One is this whole metabolic theory of psychiatry that has to do with brain energy deficits that lead to various psychiatric states that are often related to our highly processed, high sugar, starch diet. It causes basically a metabolic dysfunction, just like diabetes. And we're seeing this in everything from Alzheimer's, but also, in common mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disease, even depression. And at the same time, we're seeing the psychedelic revolution, which is sort of another angle of approaching it. So you've got like psychedelics, and you've got dietary interventions and mitochondrial interventions, both sort of emerging as a sort of a paradigm shift in psychiatry. So it
Mhm.
seems like we're at an inflection point in psychiatry where all the old ideas of you know mental illness are sort of falling away, and we're now having to think differently about how to approach these problems, which like I said at the beginning, are among the most sort of prevalent and disabling conditions that humanity suffers from today, and for which we have really lousy treatments. So
Yeah.
to me, it's this very exciting time. I wrote a book, I don't know if you know, Robin, about 15 plus years ago, called The Ultra Mind Solution, about how to fix your broken brain by fixing your body first. In other words, that there was the
Huh.
mind body effect, but there was also the body mind effect. So if you had
Yeah.
microbiome issues or immune issues or inflammation or mitochondrial dysfunction, or these can all manifest as psychiatric problems or as problems of attention or memory. I just think we're just this exciting moment. What I kind of want to sort of ask a little bit more about is some of the clinical applications of these things. And you've done some interventional trials, for example, with psilocybin and depression. It was published in JAMA and also Lancet, and you've really shown how these treatments can be very effective when often traditional psychiatric medicine can't, and have long-lasting effects. So I'd love you to talk about sort of how you think about these things being applied at scale in the population in terms of psychiatric medicine.
I guess mechanistic approach has led me along. That's the greatest mystery, I feel, the phenomenology of everything, mental health, psychedelic experiences. That's been so well characterized. That's been done to death, you might say. Whereas the black box that we're still in the dark about and are only sort of feeling sort of certain shapes now and getting some handle on things is the biology of it all, really. And just like, say germ theory and how that revolutionized medicine and longevity and so on. Once we better understand mechanisms, it's so empowering. I don't think the penny drops for people so easily around mechanisms. I've heard people in the psychedelic space say, oh, we know it works, or we just need to show the man,
Yeah,
the regulators, that it works because we know it
yeah,
works. And I kind of get that, but it's very naive, and it's very preaching to the choir, because there's a world out there that doesn't get this and is actually very suspicious of it.
mm,
To demonstrate how it works is very important and powerful on an epistemic level, on understanding this thing, but also on a practical level, because only by understanding, how it works, do you shed light on the actual nature of the problem that you're now
yeah.
solving and how to solve it better. So it's a very powerful perspective once you realize its importance. Yeah, so I do very much like that. You can go in either direction, top down, mind to body or bottom up, body to mind, and the power of being open to both and harnessing both could very much be the way of the future.
So in terms of the applications, in your work around, different mental health issues, the way I see these, and maybe I'm just sort of naive about it, is that they seem to work better for things like depression, anxiety, trauma, but maybe not so well for things like, personality disorders, or do they work in bipolar situations? And I'm curious about what the best applications for these are.
I think your intuition's right. The only caveat is that, but those things are also easier to treat with other treatments. Sure, they're not that good. So SSRIs is the path the thing we could unpack here. Though I had a strong feeling. We did a trial, as you said, with treatment-resistant depression. That was the first depression trial of this current era, this psychedelic renaissance, as people describe it. That really, got a snowball going. And we did that small trial. It ended up being 20 people and saw really promising results. But we also learned a hell of a lot about the challenges. So some people, it was a beautiful recovery. They looked like a different person afterwards. And I stayed in touch with a few of them, and they're still well. They've never relapsed.
Amazing.
And this is 10 years on. Yeah, one of them, our first patient, a lovely lady, sort of taken on a world of burden, social worker, living in London, and just tough life circumstances and so on, and developed depression very early on into middle-aged, and she had been on, I don't know how many antidepressants, but so many, let's say 7. Some people have tried 14 in that trial. And this got her well, and she's still well. I caught up with her recently. It's beautiful. So it can turn things around. But those are the best cases. But in that trial, we also saw more complex, complicated cases. And I think when those people came along, there was more going on than just a depression. There always is, but there was, complex trauma histories. There were other diagnoses that could come in, like autism spectrum disorder and borderline personality disorder. So I think your intuition's right that it's harder to treat that complexity, but the caveat being it's harder to treat full stop. So can psychedelics be effective, but done in a different way? In those early trials, and still in a lot of trials, it's almost a one and done approach, meaning it's only 1 or 2 treatment sessions. And the strong impression I've got, and others too, is that that's not enough for the complexity, and actually a broader, and that's why I brought up borderline earlier, a broader therapeutic period of time is required to really, work on those complexities that are in these people.
So more treatments and maybe higher doses or different doses?
Yeah, more treatments, not necessarily higher doses. I don't think we need to go to more drug for that complexity necessarily. I wouldn't rule it out either, but funnily enough, a more generous amount of psychotherapy. I know that's expensive and almost a luxury in the modern healthcare system, but that they're very unstable, and the complexity for me says there's psychological complexity. This ain't going to be easy. Yeah, let's not be too naive and idealistic that we could turn it around with a quick fix. So that's basically what I mean with those more complex cases. But I still think psychedelics could be helpful. There's just some more finesse is required in that treatment.
I mean, personality disorders are interesting because they're they're the thing. When I was in medical school, you were taught that these are just intractable, and they don't change. And the joke was that if you have an anxiety or sort of neurotic disorder, you drive yourself crazy and think the rest of the world is fine. But with a personality disorder, you think you're fine and you drive everybody else crazy. and so there's little insight, and so it's hard. Those are treatment resistant problems, and yet they're pretty prevalent. And the question, what is the origin of these? Are they trauma? Can they be treated with some of these compounds? I don't know if anybody's looking at that, but I think it's an interesting area where there's narcissistic personality or borderline.
But I'll bring in something that I haven't so far, and it's important, which is, and we've alluded to it, which is, yes, this is psychedelic assisted therapy. So this isn't just giving a drug. This is providing some kind of psychological supportive container. And we have these components set and setting. Set is your mindset, your expectations, your psychology that you bring to the experience. And then setting is the environment, all the environmental factors. Back in the 60s, I believe it was, a psychologist, Betty Eisner, brought in a third component, which she called matrix, the psychosocial matrix. So setting, you might think of as the environment in which you have the experience, the trip. There's music listening, you have ideally two people looking after you in that setting, and that things are decorated in a particular way, and there might be a sort of ritual ceremonial-esque feel even in the trials, and I think that's okay, and that's how it's been done for generations. I don't think we should worry too much about that. That might be part of how we can learn from tradition to benefit progression in the future. But that setting, and so the matrix is sort of the complex psychosocial life circumstances. It takes a homeless person. It's going to be hard to get one and done success with psychedelic therapy when they have to go back to the Tenderloin in San Francisco, or
Right.
back to the streets. And
Yeah, if you're homeless,
that's naive thinking, isn't it? So I mean, there's this other component around what could be done, even if it's sort of a triaging, like, okay, so could we not do this because their matrix is so bad? That feels really tragic. Or is there a way of doing some kind of group work where there's, I don't know, now it's getting idealistic, but is there a way to work on that very negative matrix too in these treatments?
Yeah, I think Paul Farmer calls that structural violence, the social, political, and economic conditions that drive disease, right? So if you're living on the homeless district in San Francisco and the Tenderloin, which you're talking about, it's hard to kind of go think about having a psychedelic experience and then going back and living on the street and being okay.
And that's it, that's what this biopsychosocial model it gives us, is a fuller, it's a more comprehensive look at the problem. And it's because for many, I believe, if we're honest and accurate, there's a realization that that's because all of this stuff matters and contributes, and it would be too naive and simplistic to think it could be just all biology, say, and that'll solve the problem. And maybe what's dominated psychiatry since the 50s, 60s, 70s has been, the drug revolution in psychiatry and chronic medication, whether that's with antidepressants or mood stabilizers. It's a way of treating that is about mollifying symptom severity, taking the edge off. My feeling was that psychedelic therapy is radically different. It's this more holistic treatment approach that recognizes the different ways that the illness expresses and is caused, and therefore will treat it as such, so treating all the different elements, recognizing all the different elements, the biopsychosocial, spiritual. But SSRIs is different. It ain't that. Typically, it's doctor prescribes you your escitalopram and your Lexapro, and off you go with your prescription to CVS or what have you, and you pick it up, and that's the system. And well, that was quick, that was easy, and that's my treatment for depression. And then you go back home and okay, it's taking the edge off, life feels a little easier, but I have no sex life now, or life's also a little depleted somehow. I'm not really feeling it so much when I listen to this music or what have you. So, actually a psychiatrist colleague of mine who was open about his own depression and medication for it said, oh, I'm a classic responder to SSRIs. But for me, I'd have to live 3 years to get one. Well, it's like life
It's a dull's
is
experience,
somehow flat. Yeah. And he's open to psychedelic therapy as well. But it's interesting. So these are different approaches. They're different models that work in different ways. And one is a one of symptom mollification through a biocentric approach. developed, inspired mostly by animal research.
But it doesn't really work that well. I mean, when you look at the response rates to SSRIs across depression, it's pretty shitty. I mean, they do work for some people, but for the majority,
Right.
it's
Barely
marginal.
50%. Yeah, barely 50% response, and then the response that you get, is it really a good and full response? Are you really living again? Are you really flourishing? I don't know. And then the other side effects. So psychedelics, it's a different approach. It requires a bit of courage, actually. Or a lot of courage. It's like, oh, we're going to have to go to some dark stuff potentially.
Yeah.
That ain't easy. And all this weird, for a naive person who doesn't know psychedelics, this all sounds horribly scary. Like, oh God, I got to go through some kind of hell. When it's told right, which I often like to do, I don't want to dress it up that this is, a one-way ticket to meeting God and spiritual enlightenment. Sure, that can happen, but sometimes it can be really hellish. It can be horrible for people, and judgment's impaired. And if people aren't being looked after, that could be dangerous for them. So there's very much a way to do this and a way to hold it. And let's be honest about human nature and the psyche, that when you release the unconscious, it ain't all light,
Yeah.
It's just as much shadow as light.
But it seems when you're in those experiences, you're better able to hold the darkness. In other words, whatever you're reliving or experiencing, your brain is in this state where you're able to tolerate reliving or experiencing or thinking about it in ways that can release some of that trauma.
To be honest, Mark, I'd say it depends. It depends. If you're held well by the set and setting, then yes.
Yeah.
It's like
you can have a bad trip too,
you
right?
can look at anything.
Right.
Yeah, you can look at your abuser and they manifest as a devil figure.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that because I'm holding you, and you can almost make peace, or let's say make peace with this thing that has tormented you for the rest of your life. And that's the beauty, that's the magic. But if that happens and you're out at Burning Man and all of a sudden you're having an experience like that, I mean, it could go well, but it might not.
Yeah.
And so it's very intentional the way we do this work. And hopefully people are hearing and realizing that it's really a world away from going off to CVS and getting your Lexapro prescription. And the mechanism is different as well. The Lexapro will release serotonin, sort of bathe the brain in more serotonin, which helps you get by. It takes the edge off stress. It's like incubating against stress and those slings and arrows. But what psychedelics do is actually a more direct stimulation of a certain aspect of the serotonin system, promoting plasticity. It's definitely psychological plasticity, and probably neuroplasticity too. And saying it that way might be a little enlightening for people, because they might think, oh, the neuroplasticity thing, that's a done deal, right? Well, in mice, but human evidence of neuroplasticity, it ain't really there yet. We're working on it. We'll have some brain imaging markers of it quite soon.
Yeah.
But the whole story is based on work in little mice brains and not much else, to be honest.
Well, that's the beauty of your work, using functional MRIs. For those who don't know what they are, they're not just looking at the structure of your brain. They're looking at the function in a dynamic way, where you're looking at different metabolic pathways, different neurotransmitter functions, inflammation, lots of things you can detect that you wouldn't see just looking at a structural image. It's fixed. And that's where you're seeing a dynamic picture of brain function. And I think, some of the data showing that some of these compounds like psilocybin increase various trophic factors for the brain, like BDNF or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that helps to sort of increase brain connections and sort of neuroplasticity. So I think there's some of that data that looks pretty promising. And I think Paul Stamets is talking about its use in things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, where there's sort of a decreased connectivity in the brain, and helping enhance that connectivity.
I just want to be careful to manage expectations is all, because most of the data in humans is fMRI, it's functional, it's brain activity, not structure. We've yet to see really clearly. I've got a paper under review. It's been under review for about 2.5 years. It's ridiculous. really held up in the review process. Who knows what was going on there? But at least it's available in preprint. People can look it up on bioRxiv. Lyons, Lyons et al. There we show through diffusion tensor imaging, looking at the white matter tracts of the brain, that there are some changes after a single dose of psilocybin. So let's see if that replicates, of course, but it's a super exciting finding. Prefrontal tracts changed. So we shall see there. BDNF, yeah, you can pick it up peripherally in the blood and see it go up. So there's a lot of indirect stuff. Could it treat Alzheimer's, Parkinson's? Well, there's a trial at UCSF looking at psilocybin for Parkinson's. It's just been published, actually. Ellen Bradley, Josh Woolley and colleagues. Really good work, really promising. It was a simple design, open label, so there's no placebo control.
Yeah.
So we need to be careful at this stage about extrapolating too much. They did see improvements even in motor symptoms, but like I said, let's be careful because placebos are
spoken like a true scientist. And all the caveats.
Really.
Yeah. It's still such a new field, so we're still learning about all the applications and the different properties it has
and
across different
Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, people will, there's been a little bit of work. People can't remember their trip. They can't remember the experience. And so it hasn't worked that well so far. Yeah. It's kind of tragic, but maybe there's a way to treat Alzheimer's earlier on that's more preventative and prophylactic. So never say never. And it's certainly sufficiently promising enough that we should be doing that work.
And a lot of the things I've seen on that too has been around microdosing. What's your perspective on microdosing these compounds versus therapeutic dosing?
It's a great theory, and in principle I can get it, that a little dose of a psychedelic could give you some of the benefit, like a lubrication, loosening the cogs, giving you a bit of that freedom, a bit of that plasticity, that ability to change, whether it's neuroplasticity or not, at least plasticity, the ability to change, without necessarily, the heaven and hell, blood and guts of a full-on psychedelic trip. And maybe if you do that, a few times a week and twin it with good lifestyle and I don't know, spiritual practice or some psychotherapy, that could catalyze those other things, and it could be very good for you. So I love the theory, and I think it could be. I think there's probably something to it. And the caveat here that I got to do, because I have to be evidence led, is that the evidence to date is a little underwhelming for microdosing. And part of the issue is that the trials have been limited. Really, there haven't been many, and when they've been done, they haven't often dosed for long enough. In my view, I'm not sure that they've necessarily had the right protocols of twinning the microdosing with something. I still believe that there's a synergy, just like there is with higher doses, psychedelic assisted therapy. There's a synergy between the drug and the way it's taken and the context in which it's taken. And I think it would be a little surprising to think that you can bypass that even with these lower doses. I still think context matters. So that's been missing from the trials. The placebo effect, as we say, it's a potent thing, so it's hard to beat placebo in these trials when they're not long enough. So I tend to think in time it will probably come through and it will be a thing. I don't think it's as easy to demonstrate its efficacy.
A lot of people are using it just for sort of performance enhancement and just creativity and it's interesting. So
like getting out of their head, so to speak. What one application, a novel one, is like a golfer. Imagine a golfer, all these lessons that they've had. Oh, I've got to do this with my swing. I can't do that, and all this. I can't do this, and all these doubts, and the yips over a putt. All this heady stuff.
Yeah.
Well, if you could get all of that crap away, and get into the body and get into a more like easy, breezy flow state, then that's a lovely
that's a
idea.
novel application for improving golf or tennis. I like that.
There you go.
Wow. Well,
Just make sure you keep the dose low.
I want to make sure we
Yeah.
cover, some of the concerns about risk, because I think, there's this great heady sort of renaissance going on now where there's a lot of promise, a lot of hope for a lot of treatment-resistant conditions, as we talked about depression and, more severe things like PTSD or complex PTSD, and yet there are risks, and there are concerns about who this could be applied to. What are the dangers? Are there people who should be worried about it? Because I imagine a lot of people listening have somebody they know or themselves who struggle with mental illness, and they're thinking, well, how could this apply, and should I explore this? And what are the sort of caveats you'd have around its application in terms of the risk profile?
Yeah, even when we're doing this conversation and I've emphasized context and setting, and this is psychedelic assisted therapy and not just a drug, you'd be surprised how many people go away from a conversation like this and think, I just need to get myself a load of mushrooms and it will treat my depression. And then they have a hellish time,
Yeah.
or they do it without someone looking after them and they injure themselves. And sadly, those tragedies have happened, and they happen, and they often happen to young people as well. So it's a real thing. The risk is real. Impaired judgment is a major one. You're tripping balls and you're tripping on your own. I don't know. You injure yourself. You think you can fly. That people think that's an urban myth. It's not entirely. There've been a number of cases of people either falling or jumping from height, or thinking they can swim and going into the sea, thinking they can breathe underwater. This impaired judgment, it's a real thing. It might sound like, oh, he's having to say this because he's a professional scientist. But no, I truly believe it. Like, you need to trip under guidance, especially if you're a young person or someone naive to psychedelics. You've really got to have that sober sitter and do it the proper way. Otherwise, the risks are a real thing. I mean, you don't literally transcend this bag of bones and go off to some, that thing's still there. It's just, profoundly altered brain function and mind function. Yeah, impaired judgment is a major risk. Also, psychological vulnerability, psychiatric vulnerability.
Could you make things worse? I have a lot of people heard about.
You could make things worse. Yeah. It could be, the fancy term iatrogenesis, that you are doing harm. You're actually, rather than improving health, you're worsening it. And that can happen because you're opening a can of worms. Someone does have a recollection of some awful trauma that they've experienced that they've buried down, and they don't have the right professional trained person to help them through that. And then so things go wrong and they've been really destabilized. It might not be as black and white as that. They might just have had a really big trip and now just don't know what's real anymore. And they start to doubt reality, like that there was an airline pilot who tried to down the aircraft because he'd had a big mushroom trip recently and was doubting reality.
Wow.
So that kind of dissociation, derealization,
that's scary. I don't want my pilot.
It's scary as hell. And so let's get real about psychedelic. It's a thing, and so it needs to be held, and the right kind of education needs to come in around the integration process, the landing, sort of relevant in that context. To ground people on terra firma and bring them back to earth after they feel like they've transcended this earth and gone to some celestial other realm. They still got to pick up the kids from school, and do the dishes and so on.
When you think about how these compounds have been used throughout human history, they've always been in the context of the right set and setting, usually in some kind of initiation rites or in some type of therapeutic sense for dealing with soul illness or dealing with various conditions. But you don't ever see this being used sort of recreationally, like in these traditional cultures. They have, very, very rigid, in some ways, structures for experiencing these things, whether it's ayahuasca or, traditional shamans with psilocybin or peyote. There's rituals that go along with this that provide the context, that provide a framework, that provide a sort of cultural and social support to kind of have this crazy, wild experiences that people are having. To me, I think, we can get that right. I think, it's going to take some work, but it seems like that's an important caveat here is that, if you're thinking about this, make sure you're going to do it in the right way with the right person who's had experience. And right
Mm,
now it's not legal. So, it's underground, but there's a
mm.
whole underground, movement of this and therapists who are doing this kind of waiting for it to become legalized.
It's massive.
Yeah. What are you most excited about next in your research around psychedelics? What do you think is the next frontier? Where are you focused? What's happening in the field that you want to preview for us?
Well, there's so much, it's hard to pick one thing. I could go to, adolescent mood disorder, depression. We want to do a trial there. I strongly suspect that we could do better than SSRIs for young people and
Hmm.
wonder whether psilocybin therapy could be that better if done well. It's one thing, the 5-MeO work, pushing the frontiers of consciousness science. Um, we're doing a set and setting study to test the assumed synergy between drug and setting. So set and setting should really matter under drug versus under placebo. So we're doing that work. And another study that we're doing, which we're close to
Mm.
completing, is a deep dive into the psychedelic experience with a sort of machine learning
Mm.
approach, an AI-esque approach.
Yeah.
AI machine learning rests on depth of data. That's the parlor trick in a sense. The seeming incredible intelligence, impressive intelligence, is because of a ridiculous amount of training. It
And,
rests on the data, deep, big data.
and how are you using that in psychedelic research?
Theoretically, you could draw from deep data from other states and then see how the psychedelic matches into that. What we've tried to do, which is sort of ridiculously ambitious in a sense, is to get the deep data ourselves by giving people psychedelics 4 times and scanning their brains for a total of 15 hours in this study. I
God.
mean, yeah, 12 of which are while tripping.
Wow.
So most of it is under, and so we're getting the data to do the training, and the data actually derives from the psychedelic. Keep it simple, stupid kind of approach. Okay, so it is really ambitious because we're trying to essentially predict the nature of someone's trip from their brain activity. If I break it down, that's kind of what it is. It's sort of, mind reading, where the mind reading is reading what you're tripping. So in the future, we might be able to do that in quite an interesting way, sort of even predicting some of the minutiae of the content of a trip, say a DMT trip.
Mm.
But at this point, we're just trying to predict whether and how intensely someone's having any psychological insight, whether they're feeling good or bad, and whether they're resisting the experience or letting go to the experience.
And
So,
is that
so
through
that's
through
that's
AI
the
you're
jump
looking at
off.
that? Through
Yeah, it's the basic mechanism of AI, which is through collecting the deep data to then train an algorithm to predict um, based on what it knows about a mapping between this in the brain, this in experience. If we see this in the brain, we can predict this in experience.
mm,
That's the trick. It's called decoding.
mm,
It's been done for a while in human neuroscience. People have used that approach. People like Jack Gallant at UC Berkeley have used that approach to predict what people are viewing in terms of movie watching.
mm.
Um, what people are listening to in terms of audio scripts. Others have done things like what people are dreaming, which is amazing. What people are imagining. Um, so there's some really cool applications of that approach, and our way of coming at this is trying to predict what people are tripping, albeit in this very rudimentary way to begin with.
And you think that'll give you insights about who to use this on, how it works, sort of how to apply it more
Yeah,
broadly?
it's a bit like the entropic brain principle. What I'm realizing is that you could use this biomarker, and this might sound very biocentric here, but let's not, diminish the importance of biology. It's still bottom line, and it gives us power, really, the biology, power to manipulate that in a positive way. We may well find that there is this sweet spot of brain entropy that people need to be at for them to be sufficiently plastic to change their abnormal, unhealthy habits, of their beliefs, for example. And so, based on some readout, seeing the level of entropy, we could dial or even titrate dosage
Oh.
to hit that sweet spot. And so, with the machine learning approach, we might see we can extend on that principle and see, for example, if I see this thing in the brain like less prefrontal cortex engagement, I can feel pretty good that this person is letting go to the experience. That they're not pushing back and resisting the experience. Ideally, I mean, we're not there yet, but I could see something like that in real time, or some like proxy of it, some other indirect measure of it. And therefore, without talking critically, I think this is the key thing that I'm not explaining yet, but without intervening and talking to the individual and disrupting their trip, I can have that information and then tailor my treatment based on that special information that I'm getting.
Almost like personalizing the therapy based on what's happening in the brain and how they're responding to the treatment. And that's fascinating.
Yeah, you could do that ahead of time. You could pick your drug like we were talking about with a briefcase of options, but you could also do it more directly in real time, tailoring things based on what you're seeing without necessarily checking in. I mean, you can check in too and talk to them, but that people often can't talk when they're under the influence, and they also they can't easily articulate what's going on.
No, it's profound. I mean, I remember being 18 and eating a load of mushrooms and just like reality never looked the same. It really reset a lot of things in my way of looking at the world, experiencing the world, and made me realize that the kind of the rigid ways that I was experiencing life was only one filter, and that I put on basically a new set of glasses and could see the world in a different way. And it just changed how I interacted with my own experience personally, psychologically, spiritually, how I saw myself in the world, how I saw the world. And I sort of, there's so much hope and promise for these compounds that have been around forever. Some of them are new. Obviously, like MDMA that's developed by Merck as a drug. I'm sort of wondering, from your perspective and the lens you're seeing the future, 5 years from now, where do you think this field is going to be? Do you think this is going to become more part of standard psychiatric treatments? Because there's so much suffering and pain, and there's so little hope for so many of these people. Are we going to get to a place where we actually have effective treatments and they can be applied widely across the population?
Yes. It's a balance of hope qualified by not by managing expectation and not falling into a trap of like a toxic positivity. Like, yeah, it's going to happen. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to happen and it's going to be complicated. But like on balance, it's going to be good and it's going to be an improvement. But sadly, there'll be tragedies, there'll be bad practice. And so we need to get that right and mitigate those risks. So I do think it will happen. 5 years, psilocybin assisted therapy or psilocybin therapy will be a licensed medicine for depression. I'm pretty confident about that. MDMA might have got through for veteran PTSD, for example. Within 5 years, I'd feel pretty confident psilocybin will be through on a federal level as a licensed medicine. And then on a state level, you have something like the legal cannabis model, where certain states are legalizing. At the moment, we have in Oregon and also Colorado's opening up adult assisted magic mushroom experiences, essentially. And I think it's close to 10,000 people, if not more, have gone through that.
It's a big data set.
Dare I say, it is, isn't it? And they're not collecting enough data, but hopefully we're going to try and change that. We're doing a survey, so watch this space on that, and others too. But yeah, people could check out my lab website to see that, because I should be advertising it because it depends on that. We need to put it out there so that people do that. We need to collect those data. It's a public health reason why We need to collect those data. We need to know whether this is safe enough and beneficial.
Well, this is really hopeful. I mean, this, because mental health has been such a problem throughout human history, and we've had really very crappy treatments, and we have different theories, but it seems like a quantum jump. Both the metabolic psychiatry field, nutritional psychiatry, and psychedelic psychiatry seem like they're sort of cracking open our old ideas and providing new pathways for people to explore around getting relief from really intractable problems that create so much human suffering.
I think so. I'd be interested what you think of this sort of comparison. But germ theory. When did that come around? 18 something or other, middle of the 19th century, and then it was only really after that lifespan. I know there are a few factors, better dissemination of knowledge, but lifespan, longevity is going up quite reliably, and so medicine couldn't treat sickness well enough for a long time because it didn't understand it well enough, didn't understand its mechanisms. Now into the 21st century, a quarter of the way in, we're still not treating mental illness well enough. Arguably because we don't understand how it's caused well enough. But I feel confident that that's going to change within this century, and it's probably going to change quite soon.
Yeah, it's an exciting moment. I remember being in medical school and residency and spending a month in a psychiatric hospital, not as a patient, but as a student. And I was just so distraught at the failure, just sort of the abject failure of our current model, and how much we were just sort of literally drugging people into stupors to manage their psychiatric illness without a real relief or benefit. And to me, this is such a hopeful time, and your work has been such a key catalyst in this, especially understanding the mechanistic changes happening in the brain, and understanding there's something there, I know, as opposed to just, some squishy, have a great trip and have a psychedelic experience and see God, and then your life's different. But you're actually trying to understand what's happening in the brain, and that's going to teach us a lot about how we need to think about these compounds and how we can apply them across the different mental health challenges, and how we need to think about integrating this into psychiatric care, into our mental health model, which really, it's so it's so far from this right now in practice, right? And yet we're things accelerate pretty quickly. So, nobody was washing their hands in medicine and before surgery until suddenly they did, after 50 years of people saying, "Hey, this is a good idea." So I think we're maybe in that moment, and it's very encouraging to me, because when I wrote my book on sort of the brain and both mental illness and both attention and memory disorders, I was so my joke was I called myself the accidental psychiatrist, because I was seeing that there were pathways to treat mental illness that I wasn't learning about in medical school or in my training, that were real, and that it was almost accidentally that I found these things. And sort of like you hear the story about the Ibogaine discovery, it was sort of an accident. There was an addict who was a narcotic addict who took it, and his cravings went away. So it was like those kinds of experiences are quite change the culture. They change our practice. So I just want to thank you for your work and all you do. We still have a lot to learn, and that's clear from how you told the story. It's like we're basically at the beginning of this journey, but hopefully it's going to unlock a lot of insights that help relieve human suffering, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. If I know people can learn more about your work, then go to your website, Carhart-Harris-Lab.com, and follow you on social media at different places. We'll put all the links in the show notes to follow Robin and track his work. And I continue to kind of follow what you're doing, and very, very excited about next steps and where we're going with all this. But I love the idea of 5 years from now being this approved therapy for various kinds of mental health disorders that really are treatment resistant. So,
well, I'd be surprised if I got that wrong. So let's see. But thanks, Mark. It's been a real pleasure. Really good to talk to you. I was looking forward to it and really enjoyed doing it with you.
Thanks, Robin. Hope to see you in person sometime soon, and go follow your work, and everybody keep track of this, because this is a field that's going to, I think, make a huge impact in suffering and humanity, which, there's very few things that come along like this, I think, that hold the promise that this does to really crack open an ossified field that has not really done very well for humanity. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My fingers are crossed.
All right. If you love that last video, you're going to love the next one. Check it out here.